At some point, you probably asked yourself a dangerous question. Why do people exhaust me? Not anger, not hatred, just exhaustion. The conversations feel repetitive, the emotions feel predictable, the drama feels rehearsed. And quietly, almost guiltily, you start to wonder if something is wrong with you. Maybe you've told yourself you're becoming cynical. Maybe you worry you're turning cold. Maybe you've even thought, I'm starting to hate people. But what if that's the wrong diagnosis? What if you don't hate people at all? What if you simply see through them? This is the moment most people misunderstand themselves, because hatred is emotional, but what you're feeling isn't emotional. It's perceptual. It's the strange discomfort of watching the same psychological patterns repeat again and again, the same insecurities dressed up as confidence, the same moral performances hiding unexamined motives, the same social rituals pretending to be authenticity. And once you see it, truly see it, you can't unsee it. That's when the distance begins. Not because you're superior, not because you're antisocial, but because clarity quietly dissolves illusions that once made connection feel effortless. Here's the uncomfortable truth no one tells you. Most human interactions run on unspoken agreements. Agreements not to look too closely, not to ask why, not to expose the machinery behind behavior. And when you break that agreement, not out loud but internally, you become misaligned with the room. You notice how morality bends when status is threatened, how loyalty fades when convenience disappears, how confidence often masks fear with better lighting. Suddenly, small talk feels artificial, group enthusiasm feels rehearsed, and outrage starts sounding performative. This isn't misanthropy, it's pattern recognition, and history is filled with thinkers who experienced this same quiet separation, not because they rejected humanity, but because they understood it too well. Some withdrew, some documented it, some learned to navigate power instead of intimacy, some turned inward and paid a psychological price. And that's where this story gets dangerous. Because seeing through people doesn't just change how you relate to others, it changes how alone you feel in rooms full of noise, how guarded you become with your empathy, how easily clarity can slide into isolation. So the real question isn't whether seeing through people makes you cold. The real question is this: what are you supposed to do once you see clearly, in a world that depends on illusion to function? That's what we're going to unpack. And by the end of this video, you may realize something unsettling. Your distance isn't a flaw, it's a crossroads. There's an unspoken rule that governs almost every social environment you've ever entered. It's never announced, it's never written down, but everyone learns it early. Don't look too closely. Don't question motives too deeply. Don't dissect emotional performances. Don't point out contradictions unless it's socially rewarded. This rule is the invisible glue holding most interactions together. People don't bond over truth. They bond over shared illusions. The illusion that confidence equals competence. The illusion that morality is consistent. The illusion that opinions are reasoned rather than inherited. The illusion that people know why they want what they want. And for most of your life, you probably played along, not because you were dishonest, but because you didn't yet see the cost of the game. But then something changed. Maybe you noticed how people subtly shift values depending on who's watching, how outrage turns selective when status is involved, how empathy mysteriously disappears when inconvenience enters the room. You start noticing patterns, and patterns are dangerous, because once you see patterns, stories stop working, excuses lose their emotional weight, virtue signaling starts sounding scripted, and emotional reactions begin to look less like sincerity and more like strategy. This is where most people feel an internal split. On one side, the desire to stay connected; on the other, the inability to unsee what's happening beneath the surface. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people don't want to be understood. They want to be affirmed. They don't want honesty. They want emotional safety. They don't want accuracy. They want alignment. They don't want mirrors. They want applause. And when you stop offering that applause, even silently, something shifts. You become difficult, too intense, overthinking, not because you're wrong, but because you violated the contract. This is where perceptive minds get punished, because society doesn't reward clarity, it rewards smooth participation. Think about it. The person who questions the group's emotional momentum kills the vibe. The person who asks why during a ritual ruins the comfort. The person who sees incentives behind morality becomes socially inconvenient. So people learn to self-censor. They soften truths. They laugh when they don't find it funny. They nod when something feels hollow. not because they're weak, but because belonging's psychologically expensive to lose. But some people can't do this forever. Some minds are wired for pattern recognition, not performance, for coherence, not consensus. And when that wiring fully activates, something subtle but irreversible happens. You stop reacting emotionally to people and start reading them. You see fear where anger pretends to live, insecurity where confidence performs, power games disguised as just joking, moral outrage fueled by envy rather than ethics. And once that lens clicks into place, connection becomes harder, not because you hate people, but because you're no longer inside the illusion that makes interaction effortless. This is where many intelligent, perceptive people make a fatal mistake. They assume their discomfort means they've become cold, detached, less human. But what's actually happening is more unsettling. You're becoming accurate in an environment that depends on emotional distortion to function, and accuracy isolates. Because clarity doesn't just expose others, it removes you from the shared dream. This is why highly perceptive people often feel socially misaligned long before they feel lonely. Loneliness comes later. First comes dissonance, the sense that you're speaking a slightly different language, that conversations are happening on two levels, and you're the only one hearing both. And here's the cliffhanger most people don't anticipate. Once you see through people, you face a decision that changes everything. Do you adapt and learn how power actually works beneath social masks? Or do you withdraw and risk turning insight into isolation? Because the next phase isn't about understanding people. It's about what that understanding does to you. Once you see through people, you don't just lose innocence. You lose naivety about how the world actually works. And this is where history quietly separates thinkers into two paths, those who understood human nature and those who suffered from it. Take Niccolò Machiavelli. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't cynical, he was observant. Machiavelli noticed something most people refuse to accept. People don't behave according to values, they behave according to incentives. They speak of virtue while pursuing advantage. They praise loyalty until loyalty costs them something. They condemn manipulation unless it benefits their side. Once you see this, the world stops feeling moral and starts feeling mechanical. That's why perceptive minds often feel alienated in social environments. They're no longer interacting with people. They're interacting with systems of desire, fear, and status. And that realization changes the stakes. Because if people are driven more by unconscious motives than conscious ideals, then honesty alone is not enough to navigate the world. This is where Carl Jung enters the conversation. Jung warned that what we refuse to see in ourselves doesn't disappear. It becomes the shadow. And shadows don't vanish. They act, they manipulate, they project, they sabotage. Most people aren't aware of their shadow. They just act it out, then justify it morally afterward. But when you see through people, you start recognizing the shadow everywhere. You notice how kindness becomes control, how victimhood becomes leverage, how moral language becomes a weapon. And here's the psychological danger. Once you see the shadow clearly, you start seeing it in yourself too. That's when the illusion of being better than others collapses. You realize something terrifying. You're not separate from human nature. You're simply aware of it. This awareness creates a new problem. If you speak openly about what you see, you're punished socially. If you stay silent, you feel dishonest. If you withdraw, you feel isolated. There's no clean exit. This is why Arthur Schopenhauer described existence as driven by blind striving, endless desire chasing temporary relief. When you see through people, you see this striving everywhere. Status games, validation hunger, moral posturing, endless comparison. And once you see it, it loses its magic. But here's the twist Schopenhauer understood, and most people miss. When desire loses its illusion, emptiness appears. Because illusion wasn't just a lie, it was a buffer. This is why clarity often feels lonely, not because people are gone, but because the emotional fuel that made interaction effortless has burned out. Now contrast this with Marcus Aurelius. Marcus didn't withdraw from people, he ruled them, but he ruled them without illusion. He accepted human weakness as a constant, like weather, not something to hate, not something to moralize, just something to account for. That's the pivot point. Seeing through people doesn't force you into isolation. It forces you into choice. You can withdraw and become bitter. You can manipulate and become hollow. Or you can develop a different relationship with humanity, one grounded in clarity, restraint, and psychological distance. Even Leonardo da Vinci, famously private and observant, kept emotional distance, not out of arrogance, but because he understood how easily distraction and social noise dilute vision. The pattern is clear. Those who see through people early either become powerful navigators of reality or quiet exiles within it. And here's the cliffhanger that matters. Seeing through people doesn't make you superior, but it does make pretending impossible. So the real danger isn't what you see in others, it's what happens next, when you realize you can no longer participate in the world the same way. There's a phase no one warns you about. It comes after you understand people, after you stop being surprised by behavior, after manipulation becomes predictable, and social theater loses its grip. It's the moment clarity stops pointing outward and starts pointing back at you. At first, this feels empowering. You're calmer in conflicts, less reactive, less emotionally hijacked. You don't need validation the way you once did. You don't chase approval. You don't feel the same urgency to explain yourself. But slowly, something else creeps in, a quiet emotional thinning. You begin to notice that joy doesn't land the same way, that excitement feels muted, that even meaningful moments get analyzed instead of absorbed. Life becomes something you interpret instead of inhabit. This is where intelligence becomes dangerous, because the same clarity that lets you see through people also starts dissolving the psychological illusions that make life feel vivid. And no one articulated this danger more precisely than Carl Jung. Jung warned that excessive consciousness, too much awareness without integration, leads to alienation from instinct, emotion, and vitality. In other words, you can understand life so well that you forget how to live it. When every emotion is examined, it loses spontaneity. When every desire is deconstructed, it loses force. When every interaction is predicted, it loses mystery. And mystery is not a luxury, it's psychological nourishment. This is why highly intelligent, perceptive people often feel an inexplicable emptiness, not because their lives lack meaning, but because meaning has been overprocessed. Even love starts sounding like chemistry. Even awe starts feeling like pattern recognition. This is where Arthur Schopenhauer becomes unsettlingly relevant again. Schopenhauer believed that once you see through the illusions of desire, the world reveals itself as repetitive striving, goal after goal, dissolving the moment it's reached. And when illusion collapses, two things remain: silence or despair. Most people avoid this realization by staying distracted, by chasing status, novelty, or noise. But you didn't. You stayed conscious, and consciousness has a cost. This is the moment Marcus Aurelius prepared himself for. Marcus understood that clarity without discipline leads to contempt for others and for oneself. So instead of retreating into isolation or superiority, he practiced something radical: acceptance without illusion, engagement without attachment. He didn't expect people to be virtuous. He accounted for their weakness. And in doing so, he avoided the trap many intelligent minds fall into, confusing emotional detachment with wisdom. Because here's the crucial distinction most people miss. Detachment can be a defense mechanism. Wisdom is an orientation. Detachment cuts you off. Wisdom allows you to participate without being consumed. This is where many perceptive minds fail. They mistake distance for mastery, isolation for insight, silence for superiority, and gradually, clarity hardens into a prison. You see too much to belong, but you've withdrawn too far to influence. This is the existential danger zone, not hatred of people, not arrogance, but sterile lucidity, a life observed from behind glass. And here's the cliffhanger you need to confront. Seeing through people wasn't the final test. What you do with that vision is. Because clarity can either turn you into a quiet exile or into someone who understands humanity deeply without losing themselves to it. And that difference, that razor-thin difference, is where everything comes down to choice. So here's the truth most people never reach. You don't hate people, and you're not broken. What changed is not your heart, it's your perception. You stopped confusing performance with sincerity. You stopped mistaking noise for meaning. You stopped letting illusions do the emotional labor for you. And once that happens, something irreversible sets in. You can no longer pretend convincingly. You can no longer unsee motives. You can no longer feel at home inside stories you've outgrown. That doesn't make you superior. It makes you awake. But awakening comes with responsibility, because clarity, left unmanaged, doesn't turn into wisdom. It turns into distance, then detachment, then quiet contempt, not just for others, but for life itself. This is where many intelligent minds go wrong. They assume withdrawal is maturity. They mistake isolation for depth. They let perception harden into a shield instead of a lens. But seeing through people was never meant to exile you. It was meant to position you, to engage without being consumed, to understand without surrendering your vitality, to participate without surrendering your autonomy. The goal was never to return to illusion, but it was also never to live behind glass. Wisdom isn't blindness, and it isn't bitterness. It's the ability to stand in reality, fully conscious, without letting reality flatten you, to recognize human weakness without resenting it, to see patterns without losing wonder, to understand power without becoming hollow. That balance is rare, and that's why it feels lonely, not because you're defective, but because fewer people are willing to carry clarity and remain alive to the world. If you're feeling that quiet separation, that sense of being present but not fully participating, that calm distance others don't seem to notice, you're not alone. You're standing at the same threshold many thinkers stood at before you, and the next step matters, because intelligence doesn't just change how you see people, it changes how you experience existence itself. And if you don't learn how to hold that awareness without letting it collapse inward, clarity becomes a cage. That's exactly what we unpack in the next video, how intelligence breeds existential loneliness. If this video resonated, that one will connect the final dots. Watch it next, not to escape clarity, but to learn how to live inside it without losing yourself.